For today's lesson, we're going to start talking about different ways of collecting data whenever you are trying to observe or do an experiment on a group of people or maybe some objects or things. Okay, so the three different ways that you can collect your data when you have to do a study is you could do a survey, which is a type of observational study. You can do an observational study, and then you can do an experiment. Okay, so we're going to talk about the differences of those three things today. And then we're also going to talk about some challenges that you may face whenever you're trying to do each type of study. All right, so the first one we're going to talk about is a survey. A survey, you have probably taken a survey before. A lot of people use these, but it's really just like you're asking somebody questions, okay? So it says a survey is a voluntary encounter between strangers in which the interviewer seeks information. This interview may take place in person. It could take place over the phone. It could be in the form of a written questionnaire. So you're just basically asking questions to another person and just writing down their responses. And so surveys are often used in observational studies because observational studies you're going to find you're just observing. And so a lot of times you have to ask questions in an observational study. So let's move on and talk about an observational study. So an observational study is where the values of the variables of your sample from one or more populations is observed. So what that means is you are observing. It is what the name says it is. You're not really interfering with anything. You're just making observations. And so what they mean by variables, when they use this word right here, it's whatever it is you're studying. Okay, so this right here is what you are trying to learn from the people you're studying or whatever you're interested in. So what you are interested in, okay, and studying about those people, okay? So you're going to observe. So the key with observational studies is that you are not interfering, okay? And so a couple other things. Observational studies are usually used to draw conclusions about the population or about the differences between two or more populations. And then an observational study observes individuals and measures variables of interest. Remember, this is kind of what you're studying about, whoever you're studying, but does not attempt to influence the responses. So for an example here, I could be studying some of the students at the school, or you could be doing a study on students at the school. So maybe, for instance, you're interested in comparing those that are involved in a sport of some kind, so like all your athletes, versus the students that are involved in the arts or maybe like band and chorus and all that, and maybe you're wanting to compare their academic performance. How and a way to do that would be looking at their grades. And so you would do an observational study for that, because you would go and find who are your athletes and then who are involved in the arts programs. And you may have a little bit of overlapping there, because there may be some people that are athletes that are also, of course, in the arts. And so you'd have to consider that in your study. But you would kind of compare them, and then you'd look at their grades, and you would compare their grades to see, is one group generally academically better off than another? And then you could start looking at that. And so that would be an observational study, because notice you're not making anybody do anything. Like, you're not making some of the students participate in sports and making others participate in the arts. You're just kind of already finding those that are already involved in those different fields, and then you're just comparing their grades. And so you're not really influencing anything from that. You're not trying to make one group have better grades than the other. You're just observing the two different groups, and you're looking at their grades. Okay. And so the main thing that you need to get from an observational study is that you're not trying to do anything to influence what's going on. You're just making observations. Okay. So you can ask people questions. You can go and observe people's grades. You can make, like, if it's a study involving weight or somebody's height, you can always make those measurements. You just can't influence anything that you're observing. So you can't go and try to make people, like, for instance, in the study that I gave you as an example, you can't make somebody have better grades. You're not trying to do that. You're just trying to observe. Okay. And so here's some good things and bad things about observational studies. Two negatives, so that's why I have the negatives here, is with an observational study, it's difficult to measure or gauge the effect of an action or a procedure. So if you're wanting to know if, participating in athletics and participating in the arts, if it actually causes you to do better grade wise, you wouldn't be able to actually say if it causes. Now, you would notice that there's some maybe correlation, there's a trend, maybe an association between the two things, but you wouldn't actually be able to say this causes that to happen. Okay. And something else that's bad about observational studies is you could have lurking variables in the study that may influence what's going on. Okay. So the lurking variables, and I'll talk about that in a second, are uncontrolled. So the study may be what's called confounded. So, like, for instance, with that example I gave you, we were looking at the students that participate in sports versus those that participate in the arts. There may be some extra factors here that could be making the students have a good grade. So, like, let's say, for instance, those that participated in sports overall had better grades than those that participate in the arts. And so it could be the athletics that help them with their grades. But there could be other factors that play into why those particular students may have better grades. Maybe they have more time at home to do things than the other students, or maybe the support that they have leads them to be able to have better grades. And so those are all examples of lurking variables. It's other factors that could play into the results that you found that aren't part of your study. Okay, so that's what lurking variables are extra factors that can influence what's happening in your study. And it's not actually part of what you're studying. Okay, and with an observational study, those are uncontrolled, so you can't factor out those extra little variables because you're not allowed to do anything. Remember, you're just observing with observational studies. The good thing about observational studies is you can use any of the data that's out there. That, of course, you want to make sure that it's reliable data, but you can use the available data that's out there. Okay, so that's a good thing about observational studies. So something else is experimental studies. All right, so an experiment is one where the values of one or more response variables are recorded when an investigator manipulates or controls one of or more factors. So that's a fancy way of saying is you're going to do something. So you're going to give a treatment to something or someone, and then you're going to observe the response. So we'll write that beside. So you impose a treatment, so you do something. Impose a treatment. and then you observe the response. So with experiments, you're actually doing something, and then you're seeing what happens. And so you're going to hear they're going to say something about a response variable. That's what this response is. So, like for instance, if I was a doctor and I came up with this new pill that's supposed to get rid of headaches, then I would conduct an experiment and I would give one group the treatment, and then I would look, does it get rid of their headache? That would be the response variable. And if it does get rid of their headache, fantastic. Then that's probably a good sign. But if it doesn't, then we've got to kind of reevaluate. All right. So you're looking at the response after you have manipulated something. You're actually doing something. Okay. So that's the big difference between an experiment and observational study. An experiment, you're actually doing something. Okay. So it says experiments are usually used when attempting to determine the effect of the manipulation of the factors being controlled. So kind of going along with what I said, you're looking at the effect after you've done something. And then here's the big thing with experiments is you can actually control whatever can be controlled. Now, not all variables can be controlled, but you actually in an experiment are going to try to, with those lurking variables we talked about a second ago, you're going to actually try to kind of weed some of those out. So you're going to do what's called control it. And so that's actually where these next two things come from. With an experiment, usually you're going to have at least these two groups. Sometimes you may have more than this, but I'll talk about that in a second. But you're going to have what's called a control group. In this group of, it's going to be either people or things, you would have randomly assigned people to these groups. And in the control group, this group does not actually receive the real treatment, okay? But most of the time they will receive what is called a placebo, okay? Which is called a fake, it's like a fake treatment. So it's going to make them think that they're getting the real treatment, but they're not actually getting anything. So this will either not receive a treatment at all, or they're going to receive what's called the placebo. Okay, which is like if it was a pill, it would be like a sugar pill. So they're going to think they're getting a pill, but they're not. And this group is used as the baseline for comparison. So if I was testing a pill and seeing if it worked, I would give this group the sugar pill, and then the treatment group is the one that actually receives the real treatment. And I would compare if both groups showed that their headache was getting better, then that might mean that my pill's not working. There might be something else that's working. Okay. And so that's the reason why the control group's important, is so that they have some group to compare with. All right. So like I just said, the treatment group, the other randomly assigned group, will receive the actual treatment. Okay. So now, from here, I mentioned a second ago, sometimes there's more than just two groups. Like, for instance, let's say that I am now a product developer and I've come up with this new cleaning product. Well, if you've seen commercials, you'll see that a lot of cleaning products compare their product with others in the commercial. So what they could do is they would actually have two treatment groups, one group that has the cleaner that I created, and then another group that has the cleaner that another company has created. And then I would have my control group, which would be maybe just using water to clean whatever it is I'm trying to clean. And then I would compare all three groups and see, which cleaning product does the best job. And so that's an example of where you might have more than two treatment groups. And so some experiments will have more than just two groups, okay? But usually that control group, you want to be there so you have something to compare it with. All right, so let's talk about Um, Something else with an experiment. It says an experiment deliberately imposes some treatment on the individuals in order to observe the responses. So we just talked about that. So let's talk about some positives and negatives with experiments. So with an experiment, it has a lot of positives. It'll actually allow the measurement of an effect of a treatment. So you're going to know if you do the experiment well, like in order for you to be able to measure the effect of a treatment, you have to have a very well designed experiment. And so you can look up some experimental design tips if you're actually doing an experiment. But it'll actually tell you, does this work or not? So, like if I was testing my cleaning product, it would say, is the cleaning product work, or does it work? Does it actually clean what it's supposed to clean? Or if I was testing that peel, does the peel get rid of your headache? Something else that's good is in an experiment, you can control your lurking variables. And so if I, for instance, was testing to see if, like, if I made an experiment where I'm seeing if daily exercise helps to perform or helps to increase academic performance, I could go and make people exercise and then maybe try to control all the other factors that could play into their good grades or not good grades. And then see, does daily exercise without all the extra stuff going on influence it? Which that one would be a little harder. So, like if I was using, or harder to control my lurking variables anyway. But if I go to that testing my headache peel to see if it helps with headaches, I could I'd randomly assign people to my control group and randomly assign people to my treatment group. And I would keep both groups the same. I would try to make it to where maybe they're eating the same type of food. Maybe I'm controlling any of the vitamins that they would normally take. That way I'll know, is it my peel that's actually helping them with their headache, or is it something else that might be helping them with their headache? Okay. And so that's what you would do in an experiment, is you would control those extra factors. So you would know, is it the actual treatment that I'm giving them that's helping them, or is it something else? Okay. So in an experiment, you can control those extra factors that might play into the response you're getting. Something else is, if you do an experiment well, it could actually give a good evidence of a causation. So if something actually worked, if my peel actually caused the headache to go away, and then in the control group, those people still had the headache, then I could say, hey, my peel causes the headache to go away. And so that would be a good thing. The only negative about experimental studies is sometimes it doesn't measure realistic effects. Like, for instance, because we have to control so many variables in an experiment, it may not be workable in real life sometimes. And then something else, sometimes you can't actually do an experiment in a real life scenario. Like, for instance, if I was wanting to see if smoking caused lung cancer, I can't go and make people smoke. Like, morally and ethically, you can't do that, right? And so some things, some topics you have to do as an observational study, because, doing an experiment would be unethical and morally wrong in a lot of situations. And so experiments are good to do if you can do them, if it's actually something you could do in real life. All right. So the last thing that I want to talk about, because we've been mentioning this, is the difference between a correlation and a causation. So observational studies, when you do an observational study, it's only going to allow you to say at the end of it that there is a correlation between the two things. And what that means is there's just a mutual relation between the two things that you're comparing. So the most you're going to be able to say is, like with my experiment, or excuse me, with my study, my observational study on comparing the athletes versus those that are in the arts program. The most I'm going to be able to say is I've noticed that, like, for instance, if my athletes did better grade wise, I would just say I've noticed that those that are involved in athletics have a tendency to do better grade wise. One does not necessarily cause the other to happen, but I have just noticed that there is an association between those that are in athletics and their grades have a tendency to be better. Okay. And so that's the only thing you can do with a correlation. Now, to say that two things cause each other, that means the relationship. It's a relationship in which one action or event is the direct consequence of another. So to say that there is a causation means that one thing actually causes the other to happen. And so saying there's a causation is a little bit more of a hard thing to prove, just because not everything causes something else to happen. Like an example I like to give my classes is right now, if we had to wait in line for something and it's going to be a while before we could do whatever it is, we all have a tendency to pull out our phone and look at our phone. Being in line does not necessarily cause us to have to pull out our phone, but because it's kind of become the trend where everybody just that's what we do when we get bored, there is definitely a strong correlation between us having to wait and pulling out our phone. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to, okay? And so that example of, phone and waiting is actually a correlation. It's not a causation. Versus if, for instance, I think about a normal car that takes gas, and I think about the amount of time that I drive, well, that is actually a causation, because the more time that I spend driving, it's going to cause me to have less gas in my tank because, my car uses gas. And so that would be an example of a causation. Okay. So a correlation just means that there is a relationship between the two things. It doesn't necessarily mean one causes the other. And then a causation means that one actually directly influences the other. Okay. And so now I'm just going to go through with some examples, and I'm going to flip it so you can see all the examples at once. And I want you to pause the video and I want you to see if you can tell me, because I've given you some examples, I want you to go through and I want you to see if you can figure out which of these studies would be better to do an observational study with and which would be better to do an experiment with to find your results. Okay, so we're going to practice that. So I'm going to flip it over. Oh, sorry, it was on a separate sheet of paper. And I want you to see if you can pause your video and see with each one of these, would it be better to do a survey? So we'll throw that in there, an observational study, or an experiment. So pause the video. And so now we are going to go through and talk about what we would do with each one of these. All right. So I'm going to go kind of fast, but I'm going to try to explain it as we go. So the first one says you want to test a treatment for a disease. Well, if you're testing a treatment, you would have to actually give the treatment to the people that have the disease. So you would have to do an experiment with that one, because you'd have to find your population would be those that have the disease, and then you would give them the treatment. So that'd have to be an experiment because you'd have to do something. You want to find opinions on a presidential election. Well, you could just ask them. So that would be a survey that you could do because you just ask them. You want to find out if 10 years of smoking affects lung capacity. Well, with this one, it would be better to do an experiment, but think about it. Could you make people smoke? Because you would have to make people smoke to do an experiment, and you can't do that. So with this one, you would have to actually do an observational study, because you just have to find people that have smoked and observe over the course of 10 years, or people that do smoke, and then you'd have to observe them over 10 years and see if their lung capacity is affected. All right, so that would be more of an observational study. The next one, it says you want to find out if jogging increases muscle mass. Well, with this one, you could actually make people jog. You might have to get volunteers for this one, but you could make people jog. So you're treatment would be the jogging, and then your response would be the muscle mass. See if they gained muscle mass, and so this would be an experiment. Okay. It says you want to find out who are the most popular teachers in your school. Well, that's another one where you could just ask. So that would be more of a survey. You want to test a vaccine for cats. Well, you'd have to actually give the vaccine. So you'd have a treatment. So that would have to be an experiment because you'd have to actually do something. Students are selected to find out if they agree with the new lunch rules. Well, that's another one where you could just ask. So that would be more of a survey. You just ask them, do you agree or not? Find 100 students, split them into 2 groups. One group walks to school and the other does not. So with this one, you are splitting them into 2 groups. Hopefully you did that randomly. And you're making one group walk to school and the other one not walk to school. So because you're making one group do something and the other one, I guess, would be your control group, that would be an experiment. The next one, compare the grade point averages of 100 students. Well, you're comparing, you're not really doing anything. So that would be an observational study. Because remember, you can always pull data with an observational study. Next one, find 200 students, half of whom participate in extra activities and compare their GPA. Well, with this one, just the wording, you have to be careful. It says half of whom participate in extra activities. You haven't made them actually participate in the extra activities. You just notice that half of them, you've selected students in a way, randomly, of course, where half of them have happened to participate in extra activities, and then you're comparing their GPA. So this is an observational study because you're not actually doing anything, you're just observing stuff. And then the last one says find 200 people and randomly split them into 2 groups. One group jogs each day and the other group does not. Well, you're making, I guess, one group jog and the other one not. So that would be an experiment. So hopefully these examples helped. Let me know if you have questions. Have a great day.